Father sold his pregnant, obese daughter to a mountain man as punishment. That's how the whole town tells it. Snow was falling on Main Street when he put her on the block like a mule, and a giant from the high country stepped forward with $5 gold. Folks whispered about what he'd do to her, but no one guessed the truth. Up in the pine-shadowed mountains, the fire burns warm, but danger's closer than the wolves. The father's shame runs deeper than the snowdrifts, and he's struck a deal with men in black coats. Men who will claim her unborn child the moment it takes its first breath. The mountain man's hands have built cabins, trapped winters, and fought off death before. But this fight will take more than strength. It will take a promise made under God's roof before dawn, in a storm that could bury them all. Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The winter sun cast long shadows across the wooden boardwalk as Marybeth Briggs pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her breath came out in small, frightened puffs in the cold mountain air. The crowd gathering in front of Henderson's General Store made her stomach twist. They were drawn by her father's familiar, angry voice. Harlan Briggs stood in the center of the growing circle, his face red with fury and something else, a cruel satisfaction that made Marybeth's heart sink. His booming voice carried down the street, echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. "Look here, all of you." He jabbed a finger toward Marybeth. "See what my own flesh and blood has brought on my good name? Lazy, worthless girl, heavy with a bastard child." Marybeth's cheeks burned as several townsfolk turned to stare. Mrs. Henderson ducked back inside her store. Tom Walker, the blacksmith, suddenly found his boots fascinating. Even kind-faced Reverend Mills looked away when she caught his eye. $5, Harlan bellowed. "That's all I'm asking for damaged goods. $5 and she's yours. Her and her shame, both." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered behind a gloved hand. Marybeth wrapped her arms protectively around her swollen middle, fighting back tears that would only make things worse. The baby kicked, as if sensing her distress. "Anyone?" Her father's voice dripped with mockery. "Surely she's worth that much, even in her condition?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several men backed away, not wanting to be associated with such a display. A few of the women clucked their tongues in disapproval, though whether at Harlan's behavior or Marybeth's situation, she couldn't tell. Then the crowd parted like water around a boulder. Jonas Rourke stepped forward, his massive frame wrapped in a heavy bearskin coat. Snow dusted his dark beard and broad shoulders. His presence commanded attention without a word spoken. Marybeth had seen him before, trading furs in town or buying supplies, but always from a distance. The whispers followed him too. Murderer, some said. Indian lover. Hermit. He kept to himself up in the high country, and most folks seemed happy to leave him there. Now his deep-set eyes met hers briefly before turning to her father. Without ceremony, Jonas reached into his coat and pulled out $5 gold. The coins clinked as he laid them deliberately on a wooden post. Harlan's sneer faltered for just a moment. He hadn't expected anyone to actually take his offer, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now, not in front of the whole town. He snatched up the coins. "She's yours then, mountain man." He spat the words. "Hope you know what you're buying." Jonas ignored him completely. Instead, he turned to Marybeth and spoke softly, his voice rough but gentle. "Get your things, Miss Briggs. Whatever you want to take." Marybeth nodded, unable to find her voice. She hurried past her father without looking at him, slipping inside the house where she'd lived all her 22 years. Her hands trembled as she gathered her most precious possessions. Her mother's Bible, her sewing kit, a few warm dresses, the quilt she'd made herself. She wrapped it all in a blanket, taking one last look at the familiar walls. When she stepped back outside, Jonas waited by a sturdy wagon, already loaded with supplies. The crowd had thinned, but those remaining watched with undisguised curiosity as he helped her up onto the seat. Her father had disappeared, probably to the saloon to spend his $5. The wagon creaked as Jonas climbed up beside her. He clicked to the horses, and they started forward, hooves crunching in the packed snow. Wind whipped down from the peaks, carrying loose snow off the rooftops in white sheets. Mary Beth didn't look back as they left the town behind, turning onto the mountain road that wound up into the wilderness. The silence stretched between them as the horses plodded steadily upward. Mary Beth clutched her bundle, stealing glances at the stranger beside her. His profile was stern, but not unkind, his hands sure on the reins. Finally, she gathered her courage. "Why?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it?" Jonas was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his words were carefully chosen. No person should be sold like cattle, least of all by their own kin. Tears pricked at Mary Beth's eyes, but she blinked them back. What do you expect of me?" He turned then, meeting her gaze directly. His eyes were a surprising shade of blue, clear as mountain lakes. "Nothing you're not willing to give, Miss Briggs. You'll have a roof over your head and food on your plate, a safe place for your little one to come into this world. After that, you're free to go or stay as you choose." The simple dignity in his words made her throat tight. She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You won't have to." His tone was final, brooking no argument. He turned his attention back to the road ahead as it curved through stands of snow-laden pines. The wind picked up, carrying the cry of a distant wolf. Mary Beth pulled her shawl closer, watching the town disappear behind the trees. She didn't know what waited at the end of this road, but for the first time in months, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It might have been hope. The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen ground as they climbed higher into the mountains. The matched pair of bay horses huffed clouds of steam with each labored step, their hooves crunching through patches of ice and snow. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the towering pines, making the trail ahead look like bars of light and darkness. Mary Beth sat as far to the edge of the wooden seat as she dared, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Though Jonas Rourke had shown no sign of threat, her mind raced with dark possibilities. What kind of man would pay $5 for a woman he didn't know? The stories she'd heard about the mountain man played through her thoughts, whispers of violence, of a deadly encounter with townsmen years ago. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, broken only by the creak of leather harness and the slow turning of wheels. When Jonas finally spoke, his deep voice made her start. "Miss Briggs?" He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "I reckon you're thinking the worst of me right now. Can't blame you for that." Mary Beth's throat felt too tight to answer. She gave a small nod, then realized he wasn't looking at her. "Yes, sir," she managed. "I want to make something clear." Jonas adjusted the reins in his gloved hands. "I didn't buy you today. No person can be bought or sold, not in my view of things. What I paid was the price of getting you away from there without more trouble." She turned to study his profile, trying to read truth or lies in his expression. His beard was flecked with gray, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held a gentleness that surprised her. "What I'm offering is shelter," he continued, "just until spring, if that's what you choose. A safe place for your little one to arrive." His voice grew quieter. "I lost my Sarah 7 winters back. Her and our unborn child both. The snow came early that year, caught us unprepared. I won't see another woman and baby lost to these mountains. Not if I can help it." The simple, raw honesty in his words brought tears to Mary Beth's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, not wanting him to see. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "about your wife." He nodded once, acknowledging her words without turning. The trail curved sharply around a stone outcropping, and the full majesty of the peaks suddenly filled the horizon. They rose like giants against the darkening sky, their snow-covered faces catching the last rays of sunlight, while deep shadows gathered in their valleys. The horses slowed their pace, heads dropping as they pushed forward. Jonas drew them to a stop beside a half-frozen creek that tumbled down from somewhere above. "Need to water them before the steepest part," he explained, climbing down from the wagon seat, "and you'll ride better in the back from here on." Mary Beth frowned. "I'm fine where I am." Trail gets treacherous. Jonas was already moving to the wagon bed, arranging thick buffalo robes and wool blankets into a nest of sorts. One wrong bounce could send you flying. Back here you'll be safer and warmer too. She wanted to argue, to prove she wasn't some delicate town girl who needed coddling, but the ache in her lower back and the way the baby pressed against her ribs made her reconsider. When Jonas offered his hand to help her down, she took it. The wagon bed was surprisingly comfortable once she settled into the blankets. Jonas had arranged hay bales to brace against, and the thick robes kept out the worst of the wind. She watched as he led the horses to drink, speaking to them in low tones she couldn't quite catch. The sun vanished behind the peaks as they started moving again, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. The temperature dropped sharply, and Mary Beth pulled the blankets closer around her shoulders. The wagon swayed and creaked as it climbed, but the hay bales kept her from sliding too much. Just when she thought the cold and darkness would never end, she spotted a warm glow through the trees. The wagon rounded one final bend, and Jonas's cabin came into view. It was larger than she'd expected, built of solid logs with a steep-pitched roof to shed heavy snow. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and lamplight spilled from the single window in front, turning the snow to gold. Jonas helped her down from the wagon, steady hands catching her when her stiff legs threatened to buckle. "Watch your step here," he warned, leading her to the cabin door. "Ice gets slick." The blast of warmth when he opened the door made Mary Beth's frozen cheeks tingle. A fire crackled cheerfully in a river rock hearth, and something that smelled wonderful bubbled in a cast-iron pot hanging from the crane. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since morning. "Venison stew," Jonas said, helping her remove her snow-dusted shawl. "Made it fresh this morning, hoping—" He trailed off, as if embarrassed by the admission that he'd prepared for her coming. "Well, you must be hungry. Sit and warm yourself while I tend to the horses." Mary Beth sank into a chair by the fire, finally letting herself really look at the cabin's interior. Everything was neat and well made, a plank table with 2 chairs, a cupboard with blue and white dishes visible through glass doors, a narrow bed built into one wall, herbs hung drying from the rafters, and a collection of well-cared-for tools lined one wall. Nothing fancy, but solid and clean. The door opened again as Jonas returned, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He moved surely around the small space, ladling stew into 2 bowls, cutting thick slices from a loaf of dark bread. When he handed her a bowl, the rich smell made her mouth water. "It's not much," he said gruffly, "but it'll warm you up." Mary Beth took a careful spoonful and closed her eyes at the flavor. Tender meat, carrots, and potatoes in a rich broth seasoned with herbs. "It's wonderful," she said honestly. "Thank you." They ate in companionable silence, the fire popping and hissing beside them. When she finished, Jonas took her bowl without comment and replaced it with a cup of strong tea sweetened with honey. The warmth and food made her eyelids heavy. "You'll sleep there." Jonas nodded toward the narrow bed. "I've fresh blankets ready. I'll bed down by the fire." "But it's your bed," Mary Beth protested. "I can't take—" "You can, and you will." His tone was firm but kind. "You need proper rest, both of you." He glanced at her rounded middle. "We'll sort out better arrangements tomorrow. For tonight, just sleep." Mary Beth wanted to argue, but exhaustion was settling into her bones. The day's events, her father's cruelty, the desperate uncertainty, the long journey up the mountain, caught up with her all at once. She managed to change into her nightdress behind a screen Jonas provided, then sank into the bed's surprising softness. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was Jonas banking the fire for the night, his movements sure and quiet in the dimming light. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe. The pale winter dawn crept through the cabin's frosted window, rousing Mary Beth from her sleep. For a moment she lay disoriented, the unfamiliar bed and rough-hewn ceiling beams making her heart skip. Then memory returned, her father's cruel words, Jonas's quiet intervention, the long journey up the mountain. A rhythmic thudding sound drew her attention. Through the window, she could see Jonas already at work, his broad shoulders rising and falling as he split logs for the woodpile. Steam rose from his breath in the crisp morning air, his movements steady and practiced. Despite the banked fire still glowing in the hearth, cold seeped through the cabin's walls. Mary Beth shivered as she dressed quickly behind the screen, grateful for the thick wool stockings she'd thought to pack. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress, stiff from the chill. The cabin's door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and Jonas's tall frame. He carried an armload of split wood, which he stacked neatly beside the hearth. Without a word, he added several pieces to the fire, stoking it back to life. "Hope I didn't wake you with the chopping," he said, straightening up. "No, sir. I'm used to early rising." Mary Beth smoothed her skirts, feeling awkward in the small space they now shared. Jonas nodded, moving to the cook stove where coffee already perked in a blue enamel pot. "Reckon we should talk about how things'll work here," he said, pulling 2 tin cups from a shelf. "Nothing complicated, just some rules to keep you safe and the place running smooth." He handed her a cup of coffee, black and steaming, then pulled ingredients from the cupboard for biscuits. Mary Beth watched as his large hands moved with surprising delicacy, measuring flour and working in lard. "First rule is respect," he said, not looking up from his work. "For the place, for each other. Second is everybody pulls their weight, doing what they can." His eyes flickered briefly to her rounded middle. "Within reason, of course." The biscuits went into the oven, and Jonas wiped his hands on a cloth. Most important rule, no wandering off alone, especially in storms. Mountain weather turns fierce quick. Even experienced folks get lost within sight of their own door. "Yes, sir." Mary Beth sipped her coffee, letting its warmth spread through her. "I brought some things. Quilts, cooking things. I can help with mending, too." "Good." Jonas settled into the chair across from her. "Cabin's yours during the day while I'm out checking traps. Make yourself to home, but mind the weather. Storm's coming soon. Can smell it in the air." They ate the fresh biscuits in companionable silence, darkness giving way to full morning outside. After breakfast, Jonas headed out to check his trap lines, leaving Mary Beth alone in the cabin. She unpacked her small bundle of belongings, finding homes for each item. Her mother's china teacup wrapped in a worn apron, a packet of carefully hoarded needles, 3 threadbare dresses. At the bottom lay her pride, a half-finished quilt in blues and whites, though one corner had torn during the hasty packing. Settling by the window for the best light, Mary Beth began mending the torn fabric. The familiar rhythm of needle and thread soothed her nerves, helping her feel less like an intruder in this strange new place. Outside, clouds gathered over the peaks, promising Jonas's predicted storm. The cabin door opened mid-afternoon, bringing Jonas and a blast of cold air. He carried 2 plump rabbits, already stiff with cold. "Thought I'd show you how to dress these proper," he said, laying them on the work table. "Different from chicken or pig." Mary Beth set aside her mending, watching carefully as Jonas demonstrated how to skin and clean the rabbits. His movements were efficient, wasting nothing. "Fur's good for mittens," he explained, carefully setting the pelts aside. "Meat's lean but tender if you cook it slow." As evening approached, snow began falling in earnest. Wind rattled the shutters as Jonas showed her how to season the rabbit meat and set it to simmer with winter vegetables. The cabin filled with savory smells as darkness settled outside. They ate by lamplight, the storm growing stronger beyond the walls. Without thinking, Mary Beth began humming softly, an old hymn her mother had taught her, one that always brought comfort. She stopped abruptly when she noticed Jonas had gone very still, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Sarah used to sing that," he said quietly, "when she was sewing or cooking. Hadn't heard it since." "I'm sorry," Mary Beth whispered. "I didn't mean to—" "No." Jonas's voice was rough but gentle. "It's good to hear it again. Been too quiet up here for too long." The wind howled against the shutters, making the lamp flame dance. Snow scratched against the window panes like tiny fingers. But inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, something fragile and new began to take root. A careful trust, built on shared meals and quiet songs, and the simple truth of 2 lonely souls finding unexpected shelter together. Days slipped past like snowflakes, each one blending into the next under the thick white blanket that covered the mountain. The cabin's routine became familiar to Mary Beth, her hands finding purpose in the daily tasks that kept their shelter warm and welcoming. Every morning she helped Jonas haul fresh water from the creek, their boots crunching through snow as they carried the heavy buckets. The cold air burned her lungs, but the work kept her warm. In the afternoons, she stirred bubbling stews of dried beans and preserved meat, adding pinches of precious salt and dried herbs that Jonas had stored away. Her needle flew through the worn fabric of Jonas's heavy work shirts, patching tears and reinforcing seams. The quiet hours of sewing gave her time to think, to come to terms with how different her life had become in such a short time. One night, the wind rose to a fearsome howl that rattled the cabin's walls. Mary Beth woke with a start, her heart pounding. Through the darkness, she saw Jonas's silhouette moving near the hearth, adding logs to the dying fire. "Storm's got teeth tonight," he said softly, noticing she was awake. "Best keep the fire high." Mary Beth sat up, pulling her blanket around her shoulders. "Sounds like wolves out there." "Just the wind in the pines?" Jonas settled into the chair near her bed, the firelight catching the silver threads in his beard. "Though we do get wolves, come the lean times." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance. Something about the late hour, the howling storm, made it easier to speak of harder things. "I never told you," Mary Beth said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about the baby's father." She touched her rounded belly, feeling the child move within. He was a traveling preacher, came through town last spring. Reverend Thomas Shaw, he called himself, spoke so fine about God's love and mercy. Jonas remained quiet, listening. "He promised marriage," she continued, twisting the blanket in her hands. "Said we'd build a life together, serving the Lord. Then one morning, he was just gone, left nothing but shame behind him." "Some men wear their false faces well," Jonas said, his deep voice gentle. "Don't make it your shame to carry." Mary Beth wiped at her eyes. "What about you? Why do you live so far from everyone?" The fire crackled in the silence before Jonas spoke. "There was a killing, years back. Town folks don't forget such things, even when they happen for right reasons." He stirred the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. Young Ute boy, couldn't have been more than 12 summers. Some men claimed he'd stolen horses. They'd been drinking, wanted to make an example. His hands tightened on the poker. "I found them with a rope, about to string him up." "What did you do?" Mary Beth asked softly. "What needed doing? One of them drew on me first. I shot him dead." Jonas set the poker down carefully. "Boy got away safe, but the dead man had kin in town. They twisted the truth until I was the villain. Easier to hate a mountain man than face their own wickedness." Morning came with fresh snow and lighter hearts, as if the night's confessions had cleared the air like the storm. Mary Beth found Jonas in his workshop, carefully repairing the webbing on a pair of snowshoes. "Winter can trap the spirit worse than the body," he said, looking up from his work. "Thought you might want to learn how to use these." By midday, they were out in the bright snow, Mary Beth tottering like a newborn colt on the unfamiliar snowshoes. Jonas showed her how to walk with a wider stance, keeping her balance on the strange devices. "Small steps at first," he instructed, demonstrating the technique. "Let the shoe do the work." Mary Beth tried to copy his movements, but her feet tangled, and she pitched forward with a surprised laugh. Jonas caught her arm, steadying her before she could fall. "There you go," he encouraged. "Nobody learns without a few stumbles." They practiced until Mary Beth could manage a slow but steady pace. The exercise brought color to her cheeks and lightness to her heart. Out here, away from judging eyes, she could simply be herself, a woman learning something new, finding joy in the crisp winter day. Their good mood faded when they returned to the cabin. Fresh tracks circled the building, the distinctive prints of wolves pressed deep in the new snow. Jonas's face grew serious as he studied the tracks. "At least 3, maybe 4, he said, following the trail with his eyes. Hungry to come this close. Inside, he went straight to his rifle, checking the mechanism and counting his ammunition. "We'll need to be more careful," he said, showing Mary Beth how to bar the door properly. No going out alone, especially near dawn or dusk. He spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the door and checking the window shutters, making sure no desperate predator could force its way in. Mary Beth watched him work, feeling strangely secure despite the danger. Here was a man who faced threats head-on, who knew how to protect what was in his care. As evening settled over the mountain, they shared a quiet meal of beans and cornbread. The wolves' tracks were a reminder of winter's harsher face, but inside the cabin, they had built something strong. A trust born of shared stories and simple truths, a foundation sturdy enough to weather whatever storms might come. A week of relative peace passed in the mountain cabin. The wolves hadn't returned, but their presence lingered in Jonas and Mary Beth's heightened caution. Every evening they checked the door's heavy bar and shuttered the windows tight against the gathering dark. On the seventh night, as snow fell in thick curtains outside, a sharp knock rattled the cabin door. Jonas reached for his rifle, while Mary Beth drew back into the shadows near the hearth. "Who rides in this weather?" Jonas called out, his voice carrying authority. "A friend who remembers mercy," came the response, muffled by wind. Jonas's shoulders relaxed at the familiar voice. He unbarred the door to reveal a tall man wrapped in layers of wool and fur, snow crusted on his shoulders and hat. Henry Two Elk stepped inside, bringing a blast of cold air with him. "Brother," Jonas said warmly, clasping Henry's arm, "you're far from the reservation in this weather." Henry stamped the snow from his boots and unwound his scarf. His dark eyes were serious as they fell on Mary Beth. News couldn't wait for better trails. Mary Beth moved forward to stir the fire, adding fresh logs. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Jonas gestured for Henry to take the chair closest to the warmth. "Let me make some tea," Mary Beth offered, already reaching for the kettle. She'd learned where Jonas kept everything in his orderly cabin. Henry's gaze followed her movements. "The town's talking about you, sister, and not just idle gossip." Soon they sat with steaming cups, the wind howling outside like a living thing. Henry warmed his hands around his cup before speaking. "I've been watching the courthouse," he said. "Judge Dellinger's not his own man anymore. Railroad money talks louder than justice these days." Jonas leaned forward. "What's this about, Henry?" "Your father," Henry said to Mary Beth, his voice gentle but firm. "He's filed an abandonment claim with the court. Says you left his protection willingly, gave up your rights. Under territorial law, if the judge upholds it, your child will legally belong to him." Mary Beth's hand flew to her belly, tea sloshing in her cup. "No," she whispered. "He can't." "He aims to," Henry continued. "And there's more. That railroad agent Greeley, he's been meeting with your father and the judge after hours. They're planning something bigger." Jonas's face hardened. "The rail spur." Henry nodded. "They want your mountain, Jonas. A new line from Denver, cutting through these slopes. Your land stands in their way." "So that's the game," Jonas said quietly. "Harlan gets his revenge, the railroad gets its route, and the judge gets his pockets lined." Mary Beth set her cup down with trembling hands. "What can we do?" "There's a hearing set for early spring," Henry explained. "You'll need to present evidence then. Witnesses, documents, anything to prove Harlan's claim false. But—" He glanced at the snow-filled window. "The mountain passes won't clear until at least March." Jonas stood and paced the length of the cabin, his steps heavy with thought. "We can't wait that long. Once the snow melts, they'll move fast." "I've been searching the territorial archives," Henry said. "There might be an older law we can use, something about protecting mothers and children. I need to check some records at the reservation." Mary Beth watched the two men, these unlikely brothers bound by an act of courage years ago, her fear for her baby mixed with determination. "I won't let him take my child," she said firmly. "Not to spite me, and certainly not to help the railroad steal your land." Jonas stopped pacing and looked at her with respect. The frightened woman he'd brought up the mountain was finding her strength. "We'll fight," he promised. "All of us together." He turned to Henry. "You'll stay tonight? The trail's too dangerous in the dark. Henry nodded gratefully. Until first light? Then I need to reach the reservation before the next storm hits? Mary Beth busied herself preparing a late supper of corn pone and dried venison stew. As they ate, Henry shared news of the town, how the railroad's promises of prosperity had divided longtime neighbors, how even the church seemed split between those supporting progress at any cost and those questioning the price. The fire burned low as they talked, casting long shadows. Mary Beth's mind kept returning to her father's cruel scheme. She remembered his public humiliation of her, how easily he'd sold her for $5. Now he wanted to sell her child to the railroad's interests. Try to rest, Jonas told her, seeing the worry in her face. We've got friends we didn't know about. He nodded toward Henry, who was spreading his bedroll near the fire. And sometimes the longest trails lead to the right destination. Mary Beth retired to her curtained corner, but sleep was long in coming. Through the night, she listened to the wind's mournful song and prayed for protection, not just for her unborn child, but for this strange new family forming in the heart of winter. A mountain man who'd shown her true kindness, a Ute scout who carried friendship like a sacred trust, and herself, no longer a victim of her father's cruelty, but a woman finding her own path through the storm. The day after Henry's arrival, the sky darkened to a deep slate gray. The wind picked up, driving snow in horizontal sheets past the cabin windows. Jonas stood at the door, studying the heavy clouds. "Storm's getting worse," he said, his voice grim. "Henry, you'd best stay another day. No sense risking the passes now." Henry nodded, already removing his coat. "The spirits speak through the wind. They say wait." Together, the three of them fell into a rhythm of survival. Jonas led them into the tree line, where they gathered armloads of fallen branches and cut fresh wood. The axe rang out against frozen logs, echoing off the mountainside. Mary Beth's arms ached from carrying, but she worked without complaint, knowing their lives might depend on keeping the fire fed. Inside, Henry showed Mary Beth how to melt snow efficiently in Jonas's largest pot, explaining how his people had survived winters in these mountains for generations. "The snow tells stories," he said, demonstrating how to check for clean drifts away from tree debris. "Listen to what it teaches." Jonas spent the afternoon setting extra trap lines, knowing they'd need meat to wait out the storm. He returned with 2 rabbits and a grouse, their frozen bodies already dusted with fresh snow. Mary Beth cleaned them carefully, saving every usable part as Jonas had taught her. When evening drew in early, as it did these short winter days, they gathered around the table. Jonas spread out a worn map, sketching possible routes to town with a stick of charcoal. His large fingers traced the passes and valleys, marking places where deep snow might block their way. "Here," he pointed to a narrow valley. "The spring thaw usually starts earliest, but we'd need at least 2 weeks of warm weather before it's passable." Henry leaned in, studying the route. The reservation's medicine woman knows these trails. She might have other paths to suggest. Mary Beth watched them plan, her hand resting on her growing belly. After they finished supper, she pulled out the small notebook she'd brought from town. By lamplight, she began recording the day's events, finding comfort in putting words to paper. "Dear Diary," she wrote, "the storm grows fiercer, but I've never felt safer. Jonas shows such quiet kindness in everything he does. He never mentions the $5 he paid, never treats me like property. Instead, he teaches me to survive, to be strong. Henry brings wisdom from his people, helping us see the mountain not as an enemy, but as a teacher. I'm grateful for both of them." The next afternoon, while Henry and Jonas checked the roof supports, Mary Beth found herself alone with Jonas in the cabin. She watched him stack firewood near the hearth, his movements efficient and practiced. "Jonas," she said softly, "may I ask you something?" He straightened, brushing wood chips from his shirt. "Course you can." "Why do you live up here alone? Even before the winter, I mean." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, adding another log to the fire. "After what happened with that lynch mob, after I killed that man to save Henry?" He stared into the flames. Town showed its true face that day. Good people stood by, said nothing while they tried to hang a boy for being Indian. When I stopped it, they turned on me instead, spread tales about me being dangerous, unnatural for living apart. He shook his head. Realized I'd rather trust the mountain than folks who'd watch a child die for spite. Mary Beth touched his arm gently. You did the right thing. Henry's alive because of you. A ghost of a smile crossed Jonas's weathered face. Reckon so? Mountain's been good to me since then. Provides what I need, asks only respect in return. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a shout from outside. Henry stood at the door, pointing to the sky. Wind's shifting! They hurried out to see breaks in the clouds, patches of blue appearing like hope itself. Warm air moved through the trees, and they could hear the soft patter of melting snow dropping from branches. Might be the start of a thaw, Jonas said cautiously. They worked through the afternoon, clearing paths around the cabin and checking Jonas's trap lines while the weather held. Mary Beth even managed to hang some clothes on a line, strung between pines, the frozen fabric slowly softening in the warmer air. But by evening, the wind shifted again. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing the sharp smell of new snow. The temperature plummeted as the sun set, and the wind rose to a howl. Henry, we'd best check those roof supports again, Jonas said, pulling on his heavy coat. This storm feels mean. The two men spent hours on the cabin's roof, hammering extra boards across the logs and clearing heavy snow before it could build up. Mary Beth passed up tools as they needed them, watching anxiously as they worked by lantern light in the growing storm. Inside her diary that night, Mary Beth wrote, The mountain tests us, but we face it together. Jonas and Henry work as brothers, despite what the town thinks of them both. I understand now why Jonas chose this life. Here, a person is judged by their actions, not by rumors or spite. Here I can be more than just Harlan Briggs's shameful daughter. I can be strong, useful, maybe even worthy of the friendship these good men offer so freely. The new storm settled in like a hungry beast, shaking the cabin walls and driving snow through every tiny crack. But inside, they had wood stacked high, meat hanging from the rafters, and water melting by the fire. More importantly, they had each other, three outcasts from the world below, finding strength in shared trust and quiet understanding. That night, as the wind screamed across the mountain, Mary Beth listened to Jonas and Henry talking softly by the fire, their voices mixing with the storm's fury. She felt the baby move within her and smiled, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer alone in facing them. The first week of March brought subtle changes to the mountain. Icicles dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves, and patches of dark earth began showing through the thinning snow. The air carried a different scent, wet pine needles and thawing soil mixing with the lingering winter chill. Henry stood on the cabin's porch, adjusting the straps of his pack as he prepared for the journey down to the lowlands. His breath still clouded in the crisp morning air, but the path ahead looked passable. I'll speak with the elders first, he said, checking his snowshoes one final time. There are those who remember the day you saved me, Jonas. Their words carry weight, even in a white man's court. Jonas nodded, his expression serious. Be careful on that south slope. Snow's unstable when it starts to melt like this. Mary Beth stepped forward, offering Henry a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Some dried venison and biscuits for your journey. Her voice softened. Thank you for helping us. Henry accepted the bundle with a slight bow, a gesture of respect from his people. You showed me kindness when others would not, he said to them both. Now I return that kindness. This is the way of balance. They watched him disappear into the trees, his dark figure growing smaller against the white landscape. The mountain seemed oddly quiet after he left, as if holding its breath before the great change of seasons. Later that afternoon, Jonas led Mary Beth to a small clearing behind the cabin. He carried his rifle, a well-worn Winchester that had seen years of use. Snow crunched under their boots as he set up some tin cans on a fallen log. Time you learned to handle this, he said, checking the rifle's action. Can't always be around to watch over things. Mary Beth took the weapon carefully, surprised by its weight. Her father had never allowed her near firearms, claiming they weren't for women's hands. Jonas showed her how to hold it properly, his large hands adjusting her grip with gentle patience. "Stock goes firm against your shoulder," he explained. "Line up the sights like this." He demonstrated, then watched as she tried to copy his stance. "That's right. Now breathe slow and squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." The rifle's report cracked through the mountain air. Mary Beth jumped slightly but kept her grip firm. She'd missed the cans completely, but Jonas nodded approvingly. "Good. You didn't flinch away from it. That's half the battle right there." They spent an hour practicing until Mary Beth could consistently hit the closest cans. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, but pride warmed her chest. Another skill learned. Another step toward independence. As the afternoon waned, Jonas headed out to check his trap lines. "Won't be gone long," he promised, shouldering his pack. "Remember what I showed you about the rifle?" Mary Beth busied herself with mending while he was gone, trying not to watch the shadows lengthen across the snow. A distant howl made her pause, needle halfway through a patch. She moved to the window, scanning the tree line. There, a gray shape moved between the pines. A wolf, larger than she'd imagined, stood watching the cabin. Its ribs showed clearly through its winter coat, and its eyes reflected a desperate hunger that made her shiver. She retrieved the rifle, checking it was loaded as Jonas had shown her. The wolf took a step forward, then another. Mary Beth's hands trembled slightly as she raised the rifle. Before she could decide whether to shoot, Jonas's voice boomed from the path behind the cabin. "Get back, you mangy cur!" The wolf's head snapped toward him. Jonas fired a shot into the air, and the creature melted back into the forest. He hurried to the cabin, his face tight with concern. "You all right?" Mary Beth nodded, her heart still racing. It looked so thin. "Bad winter for hunting," Jonas said, setting down his pack. "Makes them bold. And dangerous. We'll need to be extra careful until spring properly arrives." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Mary Beth stared into the flames. The wolf's desperate eyes reminded her of other hungry stares, the townspeople watching her shame, feeding on her humiliation. "Jonas," she said quietly, "I'm scared of going back." Her hands twisted in her skirt. Not just because of Father or the judge. Those people watched him sell me like cattle. They laughed. Jonas was silent for a long moment, adding another log to the fire. "Folks can be meaner than wolves sometimes," he said finally. "But you won't face them alone." He met her eyes steadily. "We'll stand together. Make them see you're not what they think." Mary Beth felt tears warm her cheeks. "Why are you so kind to me?" "Because it's right," he said simply, "and because I've seen what cruelty does to people. Makes the whole world smaller, meaner. Kindness, ... He gestured to the cabin around them. Kindness makes room for hope to grow. The next morning brought fresh snow, light and wet. They began preparations for the journey ahead, knowing they'd need to move quickly once the thaw truly set in. Jonas brought out his spare harness leather, showing Mary Beth how to check for weak spots and repair the stitching. "Leather's got to be strong," he explained, demonstrating the proper way to punch holes for new lacing. One broken strap in the wrong place could spell real trouble on mountain trails. They worked steadily through the morning, the familiar tasks carrying new weight now. Each repaired strap, each packed supply brought them closer to facing the town below. But the fear in Mary Beth's heart had changed, tempered by months of learning strength she never knew she had. She watched Jonas test a newly mended trace, his sure movements, speaking of years living by his own labor. Here was a man who'd chosen justice over acceptance, mercy over ease. Whatever waited for them in town, she knew she'd chosen right in trusting him. The light snow continued falling, adding a fresh layer to the old drifts. But underneath, they could hear the sound of water running, of ice cracking, of winter slowly loosening its grip on the mountain. Spring was coming, bringing with it both promise and challenge. Together they worked on, preparing to meet whatever lay ahead. The pale March dawn crept over the mountain peaks as Jonas and Mary Beth prepared for their descent to town. Frost coated the wagon's wooden sides, and their breath clouded in the sharp morning air. Jonas checked the harness leather one final time, his movements deliberate and focused. "Straps are holding firm," he said, giving the nearest horse a gentle pat. The animal nickered softly, shifting its weight on the muddy ground. Mary Beth clutched her shawl tighter, watching as Jonas secured their supplies under oiled canvas. Her small trunk, containing everything she owned in the world, sat wedged behind the wagon seat. The familiar weight of Jonas's rifle lay wrapped in blankets beside it. "Time to go," Jonas said quietly. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his strong hands steady and sure. The boards creaked as he settled beside her, taking up the reins. The horses moved forward at Jonas's soft command, their hooves squelching in the mix of mud and melting snow. The wagon wheels ground against stone as they began the winding descent. Behind them, Jonas's cabin grew smaller until the trees swallowed it from view. The trail demanded constant attention. Spring thaw had turned the packed snow into treacherous slush, hiding ice underneath. Jonas guided the team with careful precision, reading every shift in the ground ahead. Where the path narrowed dangerously, he would halt the wagon, checking the footing before proceeding. "Steady now," he murmured, more to himself than the horses, as they navigated a particularly steep switchback. The wagon wheels slid slightly, making Mary Beth's heart jump, but Jonas kept them true to the trail. By midday, the sun had risen high enough to soften the remaining snow, turning the path into a rutted mess of mud and slush. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and share some dried apple slices Jonas had packed. The valley stretched below them, still mostly white, but showing patches of dead grass where the snow had melted. "We'll make the line shack by nightfall," Jonas said, studying the sky. "Weather's holding fair, at least." As afternoon wore on, the descent became less steep but no less challenging. Twice they had to stop and clear fallen branches from the trail. The wagon's wheels gathered heavy clumps of mud, forcing them to halt periodically while Jonas scraped them clean with a stick. The sun was setting when they finally reached the abandoned line shack. It was a simple structure, weathered gray boards, standing stark against the dimming sky. Jonas helped Mary Beth down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long day's journey. "Not much," he said, pushing open the creaking door, "but it'll keep us dry for the night." The interior was bare except for a crude hearth and some broken furniture. Jonas soon had a fire crackling in the stone fireplace, its warm light pushing back the gathering darkness. They ate their simple meal of jerky and hard bread in companionable silence, too tired for much talk. Mary Beth spread her blankets in the corner furthest from the door, while Jonas took his place near the entrance. The fire's dying light cast long shadows on the walls as she drifted into an uneasy sleep. In her dreams, her father's voice boomed across the town square, his words cutting like winter wind. "Shame!" he shouted, his face twisted with rage. "Nothing but shame!" The crowd pressed closer, their whispers rising like hissing snakes. She woke with a start, her heart pounding. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and through the shack's single window she could see stars wheeling across the black sky. "Bad dream?" Jonas's voice came softly from the darkness. "Yes," she whispered, pulling her blanket tighter. "I saw Father again, in the square." "Try to rest," Jonas said gently. "Tomorrow will come soon enough. We'll face it together, remember?" Mary Beth lay back down, listening to the pop and crack of the dying fire. Jonas's steady presence helped calm her racing thoughts, and eventually she fell into dreamless sleep. Morning brought gray skies and a damp chill. They ate quickly and hitched the team, eager to cover the remaining distance to town. As they drove on, Mary Beth noticed wooden stakes appearing along the trail, driven deep into the half-frozen ground. "Railroad survey markers," Jonas explained, his voice tight. "They're mapping their planned route." Mary Beth studied the stakes with growing concern. They seemed to be heading straight toward Jonas's mountain property. "How close are they to your land?" "Too close," he replied grimly. "Henry was right about their plans for a rail spur. They want my whole valley for it." The stakes continued to appear as they descended, their fresh-cut wood standing out against the winter-beaten landscape. Each one seemed to Mary Beth like another threat, another sign of the forces gathered against them. By mid-afternoon, the town's rooftops appeared on the horizon, dark shapes rising from the valley floor. Jonas's jaw tightened as they approached, his hands gripping the reins more firmly. The horses' hooves clopped against the packed earth of the main street as they rolled into town. Townsfolk stopped to stare as the wagon passed. Some pointed, others whispered behind raised hands. Mary Beth sat straight-backed beside Jonas, refusing to shrink from their gazes. She was not the same woman they had last seen being sold on these streets. "Heads high," Jonas murmured, guiding the team past the general store where her father had staged his cruel display months ago. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." The wagon wheels rumbled over the rutted street, carrying them deeper into town. Every familiar building, every remembered face brought back memories of that terrible day. But now, with Jonas beside her and the strength of mountain winter in her bones, Mary Beth faced them differently. They were no longer just spectators to her shame. They were witnesses to her return, to her refusal to be broken. The spring mud clung to the wagon wheels as they rolled on, marking their path through the town that had tried to cast them both out. The livery stable's weathered doors stood open to the afternoon sun. As Jonas helped Mary Beth down from the wagon, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows inside. Henry Two Elk moved with quiet purpose, his moccasins silent on the packed earth floor. "Brother," he greeted Jonas, clasping his arm. To Mary Beth he offered a respectful nod. "I have what we need." From inside his leather vest, Henry withdrew a packet wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. His careful handling spoke of its importance. "The elders remembered well," he said, untying the packet. "They have written of the day you saved my life, Jonas. Each account tells how you stopped the mob from hanging me." Jonas accepted the papers with reverence, his large hands gentle on the worn pages. Mary Beth peered over his arm at the neat lines of writing. Some were in English, others in flowing Ute script with translations beside them. "These testimonies," Henry explained, "speak of your courage that day, how you faced down 12 armed men to protect a boy you didn't know. The elders remember how you chose justice over hatred." The afternoon light streamed through the stable's dusty air as Jonas carefully refolded the papers. "Much obliged, Henry," he said softly. "These might make all the difference." Together they walked the short distance to the courthouse, their boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. The building stood 2 stories tall, its white paint peeling in the harsh mountain weather. Inside, the main courtroom smelled of pine wood and lamp oil. Judge Horace Dellinger sat behind his elevated desk, peering down at them through wire-rimmed spectacles. A few townspeople occupied the wooden benches, their whispers falling silent as Jonas led Mary Beth and Henry forward. "Your Honor," Jonas said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room, "I've come about 2 matters. First, to present new evidence about the incident 6 years ago. Second, to contest Harlan Briggs's abandonment claim on his daughter's unborn child." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. "Proceed, Mr. Rourke." Jonas placed the packet of testimonies on the judge's desk. "These are sworn statements from Ute tribal elders. They witnessed the day I intervened to save Henry Two Elk from being lynched." Judge Dellinger opened the packet, adjusting his spectacles as he began to read. The room remained hushed, broken only by the soft rustle of paper. Mary Beth watched the judge's expression change as he moved through each account. "These are quite detailed," the judge said finally, looking up at Henry. "You verify these statements?" Henry stepped forward, standing straight and proud. "I do, Your Honor. I was that boy. Jonas Rourke killed 1 man that day, but only after the mob had put a rope around my neck. He saved my life when no one else would step forward." A murmur rippled through the spectators. The judge studied the papers again, his weathered face thoughtful. "This sheds new light on that old business," he said slowly. "I'll need time to review these properly." "And the matter of my child?" Mary Beth spoke up, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The judge turned his attention to her. "Yes, the abandonment claim. Your father contends you left his protection willingly, thereby surrendering your parental rights." I did not leave willingly, Your Honor, Mary Beth replied. My father sold me in public for $5, declaring me worthless to him. Jonas Rourke paid that price not to own me, but to offer me shelter through the winter. More whispers rose from the onlookers. The judge removed his spectacles, polishing them with a cloth while he considered. These are serious matters requiring careful consideration, he said finally. I will review both cases thoroughly. Return in 3 days for my preliminary findings. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. Henry clasped Jonas's shoulder. I must return to the reservation, he said. The elders will want to know how their words were received. After Henry departed, Jonas turned to Mary Beth. There's one more place we should go today. The small white church stood at the edge of town, its steeple reaching toward the darkening sky. Evening service was beginning as they slipped into a back pew. The familiar scents of beeswax candles and worn hymnals surrounded them. When the congregation rose to sing, Mary Beth's voice lifted with them. But as the first hymn ended, she continued alone, singing the song her mother had taught her as a child. Her clear notes filled the church, carrying words of grace and redemption. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me. The congregation stood silent, listening as her voice soared to the rafters. Jonas watched her face, transformed by the music and memories. In that moment, she was no longer the woman who had been sold in shame. She was simply herself, sharing her mother's song. When the last note faded, the silence held for a breath before scattered amens broke it. Jonas felt the change in the air. The suspicious glances that had followed him for years had softened. Some nodded to him as they filed out after the service, while others smiled tentatively at Mary Beth. On the church steps, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Mary Beth took Jonas's arm as they walked toward the boarding house where they would spend the night. Neither spoke, but both felt the shift that had occurred. For the first time since that winter day when Jonas had laid down his $5 gold, they walked through town, not as outcasts, but as people worthy of a second look, a second chance. The day's events had planted seeds of change. The witness statements, Mary Beth's quiet dignity in court, and her voice raised in song had begun to reshape how the town saw them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had made themselves heard. The boarding house parlor glowed with lamplight as evening settled over the town. Jonas and Henry sat near the coal stove, their low voices mixing with the quiet crackle of burning fuel. A few other boarders occupied the far corners, reading newspapers or writing letters. The elders are concerned about the railroad's plans, Henry said, warming his hands near the stove. They've been pushing survey stakes further into our hunting grounds each month. Jonas nodded, his weathered face grave. They've got their eyes on my section of the mountain, too. Reckon they want it for... A sharp knock at the front door interrupted them. Mary Beth stood from her chair by the window, setting aside her mending. I'll fetch more water while Mrs. Peterson answers it, she said softly, picking up the empty pitcher. The evening air held a bite as she stepped outside. Gas lamps cast pools of yellow light along the main street, but the side alley leading to the well lay in shadow. Her boots crunched on patches of leftover snow as she made her way carefully down the narrow passage. The well's rope creaked as she lowered the bucket. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn, expecting to see another boarder. Instead, Harlan Briggs's bulk filled the alley's entrance. Before she could move, he crossed the space in 3 long strides. Well, if it ain't my worthless daughter, he sneered, the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. His hand shot out, shoving her shoulder hard against the rough boards of the adjacent building. Papa, please, Mary Beth gasped, one hand instinctively covering her swollen belly. His laugh was ugly in the darkness. Still calling me that? After I got $100 for what you're carrying? He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. Signed the papers this afternoon. Railroad agent Thomas Greeley paid cash money for the rights to that bastard you're bearing. Horror washed through her like ice water. You can't. That's not possible. Already done. He stepped back, straightening his vest with evident satisfaction. Greeley's got plans for expanding the line. Needs proof he's establishing families along the route. Your get will serve just fine for that. His boot kicked the fallen bucket, sending it rolling. Better than you ever served me. She watched him swagger away, her legs trembling so badly she had to grip the well's edge. The water pitcher lay forgotten at her feet as she struggled to breathe through the panic rising in her chest. Somehow she made it back inside. The parlor's warmth felt distant, unreal. Jonas looked up from his conversation with Henry, his expression immediately sharpening as he took in her pale face and empty hands. "Mary Beth?" He rose quickly, crossing to her side. "What happened?" She swayed slightly, and his strong hands steadied her shoulders. The other boarders glanced their way with curious eyes. "Can we—" She gestured weakly toward the stairs leading to their rooms. Jonas nodded, guiding her up with Henry following close behind. In the small second-floor sitting room, she sank into a chair, her hands shaking as she smoothed her skirts. "Tell me," Jonas said quietly, kneeling beside her chair. The words spilled out in a rush: her father's ambush, the railroad agent's payment, the signed papers claiming rights to her unborn child. As she spoke, she watched Jonas's face darken like a gathering storm, his hands resting on the chair's arms slowly curled into fists. "I'll kill him," he growled, starting to rise. "No!" Mary Beth grabbed his sleeve. "Please, Jonas, violence won't help. He's still my father, no matter what he's done." "She's right," Henry said from where he stood by the window. "This changes everything, but not in a way fists can solve." He paced the small room, his moccasins silent on the worn carpet. The railroad doesn't give up what it claims. They'll have lawyers, documents, witnesses, all saying they bought those rights legal and proper. "But they can't," Mary Beth whispered. "They can't just buy and sell an unborn child." "They can, if the court says they can." Henry's voice was grim. "I've seen them twist the law before when they wanted Ute land. They find whatever papers work in their favor and bury the ones that don't." Jonas stood, running a hand through his beard in frustration. "Then we'll fight them with their own weapons. There must be older laws, territorial statutes that protect a mother's rights." "Maybe?" Henry nodded slowly. "I know some elders who understand the old treaties, how property and family rights were recorded before Colorado was a state. I can ask them to search their records." Mary Beth looked between the two men, these unlikely allies who had become her protectors. The lamp's flame caught the silver threading through Jonas's dark hair, the careful beadwork on Henry's vest. Different as they were, both stood ready to defend her child against those who would treat it as mere property to be bought and sold. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. "First, you rest," Jonas said firmly. "Henry and I will start planning. The railroad may have money and influence, but they don't know these mountains like we do, and they don't understand what it means to fight for family." Henry touched the medicine pouch at his throat, a gesture Mary Beth had seen him make when seeking guidance. "I'll leave at first light," he said. "The elders will want to hear about this new threat. The railroad's greed threatens all our children, not just yours." Mary Beth nodded, one hand still pressed protectively over her belly. The child within kicked, as if sensing her distress. She thought of her father's cruel laugh, the casual way he'd sold his own grandchild's future. The fear remained, but something stronger grew alongside it: determination. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Both of you." Jonas's large hand covered hers where it rested on the chair arm. The warmth of his calloused palm steadied her trembling fingers. In his touch, she felt the same promise he'd made that winter day in town, that she wasn't alone anymore, that together they would face whatever came. Henry moved to the door, his dark eyes serious. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start gathering what we need to fight this battle properly." He glanced at Jonas. "Not with fists, brother, with facts and law and the truth of what's right." After Henry left, Jonas stayed beside Mary Beth's chair, his presence solid and reassuring in the lamp's soft glow. Neither spoke for a long moment, each lost in thought about the challenge ahead. The railroad's power seemed as immovable as the mountains themselves, but mountains could be crossed by those who knew the way. Dawn brought no relief from the night's tensions. Instead, heavy gray clouds rolled in from the mountains, bringing stinging pellets of snow that quickly turned the streets white. By mid-morning, drifts began forming against the boarding house walls. Mary Beth stood at the window of her second-floor room, watching the storm build. The first sharp pain caught her by surprise, making her grip the windowsill. She breathed deeply, trying to convince herself it was just the usual discomfort of late pregnancy. But when the second pain came, stronger than before, she knew. "No," she whispered. "Not yet. Not here." She made it to the door, opening it with trembling hands. "Jonas?" Her voice cracked slightly. He appeared at the top of the stairs, taking in her pale face and the way she held her belly. "The baby?" She nodded, another pain making her gasp. Jonas crossed the hallway in 3 long strides, supporting her arm as she swayed. "Mrs. Peterson?" he called down the stairs. "Send someone for the midwife, now." The boarding house erupted into activity. Mrs. Peterson hustled up with clean linens while her husband went for midwife Turner. Other boarders offered heated water and extra blankets. Through it all, Jonas stayed by Mary Beth's side, his weathered face tight with worry. "Too early," Mary Beth kept whispering. "The baby wasn't due for weeks yet." "Hush now," Jonas soothed, helping her sit on the bed. "Midwife Turner knows her business. She'll see you through this." The storm howled outside as they waited. Finally, heavy boots stomped on the porch below, and voices carried up the stairs. The midwife appeared, snow dusting her thick shawl, her leather bag clutched in red-chilled hands. "Well then," she said briskly, setting down her bag. "Let's see what this little one's about." She shooed Jonas toward the door. "Out with you now. This is women's work." Jonas hesitated, looking at Mary Beth. She managed a weak smile. "I'll be all right." In the hallway, Jonas began pacing, his heavy boots wearing a path in the carpet. Every cry from behind the closed door made him flinch. He didn't notice the preacher's arrival until the older man spoke his name. "Brother Jonas," Reverend Walsh said softly, "I heard the news and came as quickly as I could." Snow melted from his black coat as he stood watching Jonas's restless movement. "Much obliged, Reverend," Jonas muttered, not breaking his stride. "But I ain't much for praying right now." "Then I'll pray for both of you?" The preacher settled into a chair by the window, his weathered Bible open on his knee. His quiet murmur of scripture provided a steady counterpoint to Jonas's pacing and Mary Beth's occasional cries. The morning wore on. More snow piled against the windows. Mrs. Peterson brought coffee and tried to convince Jonas to eat something, but he just shook his head, continuing his vigil. Heavy steps on the stairs made both men look up. Henry appeared, his face grave despite the cold-reddened cheeks. He gestured Jonas aside, speaking in low tones. "The railroad agent was at the courthouse first thing this morning," he said. "He's got papers drawn up claiming legal custody of the child, signed by Judge Wilson himself. They're just waiting for word of the birth." Jonas's fist slammed into the doorframe with enough force to rattle the glass in nearby windows. "Damn them," he growled. "Damn them all to hell." "Jonas," the preacher warned, but his own face showed his distress at the news. Henry gripped Jonas's shoulder. "There's more. Greeley's got a wet nurse already arranged in Denver, plans to take the baby as soon as it's born." A particularly sharp cry from Mary Beth made them all turn toward the door. The midwife's voice could be heard offering encouragement. "They can't," Jonas said, his voice hollow. "They can't just take a newborn from its mother." "The law gives them that right," Henry said bitterly, "unless we can find something to stop them." Jonas leaned his forehead against the cold window glass, watching snow sweep past in white curtains. The same helplessness he'd felt watching his wife die years ago crept over him. All his strength, all his determination to protect Mary Beth and her child, meant nothing against a piece of paper with a judge's signature. The preacher closed his Bible and stood. "The law of man may say one thing, but there's a higher law that speaks of justice and mercy." "Fine words, Reverend," Jonas said, "but they won't stop Greeley from walking in here and taking that baby." Another cry from the room, longer this time. The midwife called for more hot water, and Mrs. Peterson hurried past with a steaming kettle. Henry paced to the window and back, his usual calm demeanor fractured by tension. The elders are still searching the old records, but with this storm? He gestured at the whiteout conditions outside. No one's getting through from the reservation today. Jonas's shoulders slumped. The wind screamed around the building's corners, drowning out the soft prayers the preacher had resumed. Inside the room, Mary Beth's labor continued, each pain bringing her child closer to being taken away. Mrs. Peterson appeared again, her apron wet from carrying water. "The midwife says it won't be long now," she reported quietly. "The poor dear is doing well, but she's asking for you, Jonas." He straightened, looking uncertain. "I thought men weren't allowed." "Ordinarily, no," Mrs. Peterson said, "but these aren't ordinary times. She needs your strength right now." Jonas glanced at Henry and the preacher, who both nodded encouragement. Taking a deep breath, he knocked softly on the door. The midwife opened it just enough to eye him sternly. "You'll do exactly as I say, and you'll stay at the head of the bed. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." The room was warm and dim, smelling of soap and sweat. Mary Beth lay propped against pillows, her face flushed with effort. She reached for his hand as he approached. "I'm scared," she whispered. Jonas knelt beside the bed, engulfing her small hand in his large one. "I know, but you're the strongest person I know, Mary Beth Briggs. You can do this." "The baby?" Her eyes filled with tears. "They'll take it away." "Look at me," Jonas said firmly. "No matter what happens, we'll find a way. I promise you that." The midwife bustled around the bed, checking blankets and readying supplies. "Save your breath for pushing, girl. This little one's coming whether we're ready or not." Outside, the storm raged on, as if nature itself protested what was about to happen. In the hallway, Henry and the preacher kept their vigil, while somewhere in town, a railroad agent waited with his legal papers, ready to tear a family apart before it could even begin. The boarding house door burst open, sending a blast of cold air through the hallway. Henry stood there, snow coating his shoulders, clutching a leather-bound document. His eyes blazed with excitement. "Jonas!" he called out. "I found something. A territorial law from 1852. Jonas hurried over, followed by the preacher. Henry's mittened hands fumbled with the pages until he found what he sought. "Here. Any child born under the roof of a married couple is, by default, the legal ward of the husband unless voluntarily relinquished. The railroad's claim won't stand against this? Not if ... He looked meaningfully at Jonas. Understanding dawned on Jonas's face. He strode to Mary Beth's door and knocked urgently. The midwife opened it, ready to scold, but he spoke first. "Mary Beth," he called softly, "I need to ask you something important." She lay against the pillows, face flushed with labor. "What is it?" "Will you marry me right now?" His voice was gentle but urgent. "Henry found an old law. If we're married when the baby comes, no one can take it from us. Not your father, not the railroad, no one." Tears welled in Mary Beth's eyes. For a moment, she was silent, searching his face. Then she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The midwife checked Mary Beth's progress. "We've got time before the next stage. But hurry." The preacher rushed to ready the church, while Mrs. Peterson helped Mary Beth into a clean dress. Jonas paced nervously, straightening his coat. Word spread quickly through the boarding house, and several townsfolk gathered their courage against the storm to witness. The small church glowed with lamplight as Jonas and Mary Beth stood before the altar. Wind rattled the windows, and snow piled against the door, but inside was warm and still. The preacher spoke the familiar words, his voice steady and sure. "Do you, Jonas Rourke, take this woman?" "I do." Jonas's deep voice filled the church. "And do you, Mary Beth Briggs, take this man?" "I do." Her voice was soft, but clear. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jonas bent to kiss her gently. "I'll protect you both," he murmured against her lips. "Always." They hurried back through the storm to the boarding house, where the midwife waited. She nodded approvingly as they entered, Mary Beth leaning heavily on Jonas's arm as another contraction began. "Well then," the midwife said, helping Mary Beth back to bed, "let's bring this little one into the world proper and legal." The winter night slowly gave way to dawn, painting the eastern sky in pale silver. Inside the boarding house, Mary Beth's labor pains grew stronger with each passing hour. Sweat dampened her hair as she gripped Jonas's calloused hand through another contraction. "That's it. Breathe through it," Midwife Turner coached, her voice steady and sure. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Anderson, moved quietly around the room, replacing cool cloths on Mary Beth's forehead and neck. Jonas hadn't left her side since midnight. His massive frame seemed out of place among the feminine bustle, but his presence gave Mary Beth strength. Each time pain racked her body, his hand remained firm and warm in hers. "You're doing just fine," he murmured, brushing damp strands from her face. Outside, the storm's fury began to fade as morning light strengthened. The wind's howl softened to whispers against the window glass. "The baby's coming now," the midwife announced, her experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Give us a good push, Mary Beth." Mary Beth bore down, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Jonas supported her shoulders as she worked. The room fell silent except for her labored breathing and the midwife's quiet encouragement. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the air, strong and indignant. Tears spilled down Mary Beth's cheeks as Midwife Turner lifted a squalling infant, red-faced and perfect. "A fine boy," the midwife declared, quickly cleaning and wrapping him. "Strong lungs on this one." Jonas's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the tiny bundle. His weathered face softened with wonder as he cradled his new son. "Look what you did," he whispered to Mary Beth, sitting carefully beside her on the bed. "He's beautiful." Word spread quickly through the town. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered outside the boarding house, waiting for news. The storm had cleared completely, leaving fresh snow glittering under bright sunshine. Heavy boots on the stairs announced Judge Dellinger's arrival. He knocked softly before entering the room, removing his hat. His eyes took in the scene. Mary Beth propped up in bed, Jonas beside her, both gazing at their newborn son. "Mr. Rourke," the judge said, clearing his throat, "I've reviewed the territorial statutes. Your marriage makes the railroad's claim to this child null and void." He shifted uncomfortably. "I owe you an apology as well. I let old prejudices cloud my judgment about your character. I was wrong." Jonas nodded slowly, accepting both the legal victory and the personal vindication. Mary Beth reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Their son slept peacefully, unaware that his very first hours had brought healing to long-festering wounds. A week after the birth, spring's warmth had begun winning its battle against winter. The morning sun melted patches of snow into muddy puddles along the town's main street. Jonas methodically loaded the wagon with supplies, sacks of flour and sugar, coffee beans, and dried goods that would see them through until summer. His movements were purposeful, each item carefully secured against the journey ahead. Mary Beth emerged from the boarding house, wrapped snugly in her wool shawl. She carried their son, whom they'd named Samuel, meaning asked of God. The baby slept peacefully, bundled against the mountain chill. Jonas helped them settle into the wagon bed, where he'd arranged straw and blankets into a comfortable nest. Henry Two Elk sat astride his paint horse, reins held loose in experienced hands. "I'll ride ahead," he said, nodding toward the mountain trail. "Make sure the path is clear." His horse's hooves splashed through puddles as he guided it toward the muddy track leading upward. The wagon wheels creaked as Jonas steered the team carefully around holes and fallen branches. Mary Beth hummed softly to Samuel, who barely stirred, except to nurse. The journey stretched through the afternoon, their progress slow but steady over the winter-ravaged trail. As evening approached, they finally crested the familiar ridge. Below them, Jonas's cabin nestled among the pines, like a ship anchored in a green sea. Smoke curled from the chimney. Henry had ridden ahead to start a fire. The sight brought tears to Mary Beth's eyes. This place, that had once seemed like exile, now felt like sanctuary. Inside, the cabin glowed with welcome. Jonas moved about lighting the oil lamps, while Mary Beth settled into the rocking chair, Samuel drowsy at her breast. The familiar scents of pine smoke and leather filled the air. Outside, darkness gathered under the trees as stars began pricking through the purple dusk. Jonas added wood to the fire, then paused, watching his wife and son in the lamplight. Slowly, his deep voice rose in the hymn she'd taught him during those long winter nights. Amazing Grace. The old words took on new meaning now, speaking of redemption found and home restored. Through the cabin's window, the pines stood like silent guardians under the emerging stars. These same trees had witnessed Jonas's years of solitude, Mary Beth's arrival in desperation, and now sheltered their family. 3 souls brought together by mercy's unforeseen path. They were home at last, no longer outcasts, but a family. Their bonds forged in winter's crucible and strengthened by unwavering hope. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.